So, in this lesson, I contemplate the difference between conflict and argument, or as I often see it, is the tension between emotion and reason. The objectives of the lesson are to understand that argument and conflict are indeed different, to understand the need to avoid emotionally loaded language, and to identify alternatives for several emotionally loaded words. So to start things off, I want to clarify some fuzzy language. We use the word argument quite loosely in day-to-day talk. More often than not, when we're using it, we're referring to a quarrel or a heated disagreement. Something where there's a lot of hurt feelings and not really very much hope of an agreement. But in pure and applied science, when we talk about argument, we're talking about a logical reasoning process. It's based on evidence, and it leads to a conclusion. So, whereas a quarrel can often have no conclusion, it's just a sharing of feelings, argument in applied and pure science refers to something that leads to some defining, some conclusion. And they're different things. Argument and conflict are different. Argument, the way we would use it, is based on logic and data. We're referring to a negotiation, whereas conflict is based on emotions. And the ultimate objective of conflict is to win. Now, negotiation and winning are not necessarily the same thing, and that's one of the understandings we will take away from this course at the end. But at this point, when we refer to argument, and when I use the word argument throughout the course, I'm referring to the first, something that's based on logic and data, something that we would negotiate and discuss. And in this way, climate negotiation gets sidetracked. On one side, we have a group of professionals trained to use evidence, and their job depends on their ability to defend and substantiate the work that they're doing. And on the other side, we have a group of people with little or no training necessarily, and with no obligation to provide evidence, or even, for that matter, to tell the truth. So I like to avoid the use of the word debate. Climate change is not a debate. It's a discussion, and it's a peer-reviewed science. So it's a discussion among peers based on peer-reviewed science. Now, the word debate implies politics, your side versus my side. There is no political debate about climate change. Climate change is based on data, observations, thermodynamics, hypothesis, and substantiation. And while there may be discussion within the scientific community about that, this is not something where you would take sides. This is a discussion amongst peers. What we are negotiating more often than not in climate dialogue is action. We start from the premise that climate change is proven, and that climate action is driven by policy. Now, we need to understand that policy is inherently political, and it really should be, because the choices that we make in terms of our policy directions affect everyone. So climate change is not a debate, but climate action certainly is, and it's negotiable. And in this regard, language matters. Not believing in climate change is a matter of faith, and it's based on emotion. And in our climate negotiations, we can't diffuse emotion with more emotions. So we need to avoid emotionally loaded language. As an aside, I remember back in the day when I was teaching at the university, I would walk into a class of fourth-year engineering students. Typically, I would start the term with about 80 to 90 students in a class, and I'd ask the question, by a show of hands, how many of you believe in climate change? And then people would throw their hand in the air, and there'd be a lot of cheering and shouting, just like in any other political debate. And then I'd ask, by a show of hands, how many of you don't believe in climate change? And then they want the same similar kind of outcome. A bunch of people throw their hands in the air, and there'd be a lot of jeering and shouting back and forth between them. And then I asked my third question. What does faith have to do with it? What does belief have to do with it? How is science based on belief? And that led to a prolonged discussion with the students about the difference between science and belief systems and facts. So language does matter, and we've got to be careful about the language we choose to discuss these issues. Now, to that end, I've come up with a short list, and it's a growing list, of words that I like to avoid when I'm talking about climate change. And the first one is the word denier, and this is one that we in the climate change community tend to use a lot when we confront somebody who does not agree with the concept of climate change. So we call them deniers, but I prefer to use instead the word skeptic, because the word denier tends to be seen as code for right-leaning Luddite, and that's the way people will interpret it. So that the word denier now comes with an emotional content that is more of a smear than a label. Also, I don't like to use the word debate. I prefer the word negotiation. Debate implies political sides. Negotiations implies we're discussing action and a best action to go forward. And I like to avoid the use of the word argument, because argument is, as I said earlier, a word that can imply fighting, whereas what we're really doing is discussing and negotiating. And coming from the other side, I've been accused, because of my work in climate change, of being an alarmist. And I prefer to use the word concerned, because the word alarmist suggests extremist. It's code for extremist. It means somebody who is taking an extreme position. Whereas mostly the people who I work with in climate change are not extremists. They're just concerned. And here's one that's changed its meaning over the years, the word elite. And I prefer to use the word knowledgeable. The word elite has become a code for left-leaning academic, elitist left-leaning academics. And it's more of a smear than a compliment. So back in the day when I was going to university, if you were taking an elite course, you were taking a high quality, very special thing. Whereas these days, elite tends to mean, somebody you don't like. And the other word that I tend to avoid is use of the word expert. I prefer the word informed. Expert tends to be a code for self-promoting know-it-all. And I really like to avoid that sort of tone in the discussion. So I like to talk to informed people. And I like to, if people say, "Are you an expert?" I'd like to answer, "I'm informed." I've done a lot of work in informing myself, but we never claim to be experts. As I said in an earlier lesson, I prefer to have other people tag us with the title expert rather than claim the title expert. So this was a short lecture, but I did want to cover off these language issues very quickly, and I'd like to encourage you to share any other words that you think are emotionally loaded and what you would suggest we use in their place. And secondly, this is something that's evolving and morphing as we go along. So if on the list that I've used, identified, you think that that's changed, I'd like to hear your comments about that as well. And once again, we'll review those and share them with the rest of the participants of the course. So, what did we cover? I covered the concept that argument and conflict are indeed different things. We talked about the need to avoid emotionally loaded language. And finally, I shared a short but growing list of emotionally loaded words and what are the alternatives for using for those words in our work.